The revolver gleamed in the winter moonlight as Royce Blackwell pressed it against Daniel Briggs' chest. "Step aside, rancher. That woman belongs to me." Behind Daniel, Sarah Whitfield stood frozen in the doorway, her past finally catching up to destroy the only peace she'd ever known. But Daniel didn't move. "Over my dead body," he said quietly, and Roy smiled. "That can be arranged." Welcome, dear listeners, to a story of survival, dignity, and unexpected love in the frozen wilderness of Wyoming, 1884. Follow me to the end of Sarah's journey, and please comment below which city you're watching from. I'd love to know how far our story has traveled today. The wind howled through the abandoned streets of Snow Ridge, Wyoming, carrying with it the promise of another brutal night. February 1884 had been particularly merciless, and the temperature had dropped well below freezing as darkness crept across the frontier town. Sarah Whitfield pressed herself deeper into the alcove of Hutchinson's General Store, long since closed for the evening, trying desperately to shield herself from the biting cold that seemed determined to find every gap in her threadbare coat. Her fingers, blue-tinged and numb, clutched at the worn fabric, pulling it tighter around her trembling frame. 3 days. It had been 3 days since Mrs. Pemberton had thrown her out of the boarding house, her belongings tossed into the muddy street like garbage, her reputation destroyed by whispers and lies that spread through Snow Ridge faster than wildfire in summer grass. Improper conduct. Mrs. Pemberton had declared loudly enough for half the town to hear, though Sarah knew the real reason. She'd refused the advances of Mrs. Pemberton's nephew, and in a town like Snow Ridge, a woman's word against a man's was worth less than the dirt beneath their boots. Now here she was, with nowhere to go, no money for food, and the kind of hunger that made her stomach feel like it was eating itself from the inside out. Sarah's breath came out in small, visible puffs as she watched the Golden Horseshoe Saloon across the street, its windows glowing warm and inviting. The sound of laughter and piano music drifted out each time the doors swung open, mocking her misery. She'd already tried the back door of the hotel, the church, even the schoolhouse where she'd once taught before the rumors started. Every door in Snow Ridge had closed to her. "Well, well, what do we have here?" The voice made her blood freeze more effectively than any winter wind. Sarah looked up to see Jake Morrison stumbling out of the saloon, his bulk swaying slightly from too much whiskey, his eyes fixing on her with the predatory focus of a wolf spotting wounded prey. "Miss Whitfield," he slurred, moving closer, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Heard you've been having some troubles, cast out like yesterday's dishwater, weren't you?" Sarah pressed herself harder against the storefront, knowing there was nowhere to run. The alley to her left was a dead end, and Morrison stood between her and the open street. "Please, Mr. Morrison, I'm just trying to stay out of the wind." "Are you now—" He laughed, a harsh sound that had nothing to do with humor. "Seems to me a woman in your position might be willing to negotiate for something warmer. I've got a room at the hotel, nice and cozy. Even got some food beef stew from dinner still warm." Sarah's traitorous stomach clenched at the mention of food, but she shook her head. "I'm not that kind of woman, Mr. Morrison." "Aren't you—" He moved closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey and tobacco on him. "Way I hear it, you're exactly that kind of woman. Why else would Pemberton throw you out? Why else would the whole town turn their backs on their precious little schoolteacher?" "That's not true," Sarah whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. What did truth matter when everyone had already decided what to believe? Morrison reached out his thick fingers, catching her arm through the thin coat. "Come now, Miss Whitfield. No need to play coy. You're cold, you're hungry, and I'm offering you a solution. Fair trade, I'd say. Better than freezing to death out here like a stray dog." Sarah tried to pull away, but his grip tightened and panic began to rise in her throat. "Please let go." "I don't think so." His other hand reached for her face, and Sarah could see her fate written in his bloodshot eyes. This was how it would happen. This was how she would become exactly what they all said she was. Not by choice, but by the simple arithmetic of survival. "The lady asked you to let go." The voice came from behind Morrison, calm but carrying an edge sharp enough to cut glass. Morrison turned, his hand still gripping Sarah's arm, to find a tall figure standing in the street. The man wore a long duster coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, But even in the dim light from the saloon, Sarah could see the scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw. "This ain't your business, Briggs," Morrison growled. "The lady and I are having a private conversation." Daniel Briggs stepped closer, and Sarah saw his hand rest casually on the Colt revolver at his hip. "Doesn't look like much of a conversation from where I'm standing. Looks more like assault." "She's just playing hard to get," Morrison insisted, but his grip on Sarah's arm loosened slightly. Everyone in Snow Ridge knew Daniel Briggs's reputation. The rancher who lived alone on his spread 5 miles outside town, who'd fought in the war and carried its marks on his face and in his eyes. The man who minded his own business but wouldn't hesitate to end anyone who crossed him. "Let her go, Morrison." Daniel's voice remained conversational, almost friendly, but something in it made Morrison release Sarah's arm and take a step back. "Like I said, ain't your business," Morrison muttered, but he was already backing away. "She ain't worth the trouble anyway. Damaged goods." He spat in the snow at Sarah's feet before stumbling back toward the saloon. Daniel watched him go, waiting until the doors swung shut behind him before turning to Sarah. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" Sarah shook her head, unable to find her voice. Up close, she could see that Daniel Briggs's eyes were gray, the color of winter storm clouds, but there was something unexpectedly gentle in them. "Here." He shrugged off his duster coat and held it out to her. "You're shivering." "I can't." Sarah started to protest, but he was already draping it around her shoulders. The coat was still warm from his body heat, and it smelled of leather and wood smoke and something indefinably masculine. "When's the last time you ate?" he asked, his tone matter-of-fact. Sarah's pride wanted to lie, but exhaustion and hunger had stripped away her ability to pretend. 3 days. Something flickered in his eyes, anger maybe, though not directed at her. "Come on." "Where?" "My wagon's just down the street. I've got supplies from town, including some bread and cheese. You can eat while I drive you wherever you're staying." I don't have..." Sarah stopped, unable to admit the full extent of her situation to the stranger, even if he had just saved her from Morrison. Daniel studied her for a moment, taking in her threadbare dress, her hollow cheeks, the desperation she was trying so hard to hide. "No one should be cold and hungry out here," he said quietly, "especially not in weather like this. If you don't have anywhere to go, I've got a ranch about 5 miles out. There's work needs doing, cooking, cleaning, mending, honest work for honest pay, and a warm place to sleep." Sarah stared at him, wondering if this was just another trap, another man looking to take advantage of her desperate situation. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." "I know enough," Daniel said. "I know Morrison had no right to put his hands on you. I know you're about to freeze to death out here, too proud to ask for help. And I know my ranch house has been gathering dust since my housekeeper quit last month to go tend to her daughter's new baby. So really, you'd be doing me a favor." It was a lie, and they both knew it. A man like Daniel Briggs could hire any number of women from town to keep house for him. But he was offering her a lifeline wrapped in the disguise of mutual benefit, allowing her to keep what little dignity she had left. "People will talk," Sarah said weakly. "A woman living out at your ranch." "People are already talking," Daniel pointed out. "Difference is, at my ranch, you'll have a roof over your head and food in your belly while they do it. And I give you my word, ma'am, you'll be safe there. Your room will have a lock, and the only one with a key will be you." Sarah looked into his scarred face, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of the darkness that seemed to lurk in every other man she'd encountered since her fall from grace. But all she saw was a quiet sincerity that made her want to cry. "All right," she whispered. Daniel nodded as if she'd just agreed to something as simple as the weather. "Wagon's this way." He led her down the street to where a sturdy wagon waited, loaded with supplies from town. 2 horses stamped their feet in the cold, their breath steaming in the night air. Daniel helped her up onto the bench seat, his touch careful and impersonal, then climbed up beside her. "There's a blanket under the seat," he said, taking up the reins. "Wrap yourself up. It's a fair ride to the ranch." Sarah found the thick wool blanket and pulled it around herself, still wearing his coat. As the wagon rolled out of Snow Ridge, she caught a glimpse of faces in windows watching their departure. By tomorrow, the whole town would know that the disgraced Sarah Whitfield had left with the scarred rancher Daniel Briggs. Her reputation, what little remained of it, would be thoroughly destroyed. But as the town faded behind them and the vast Wyoming wilderness opened up ahead, Sarah found she didn't care. She was warm for the first time in days, and the promise of food and shelter, however temporary, seemed worth any amount of gossip.
"Thank you," she said quietly, the words nearly lost in the sound of hooves on frozen ground. Daniel glanced at her briefly. "No need for thanks, ma'am. Like I said, you're doing me a favor." They rode in silence after that, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Sarah pulled the blanket tighter and watched the stars emerge overhead, brilliant and countless in the clear winter sky. She didn't know what awaited her at Daniel Briggs' ranch, didn't know if she was trading one form of danger for another. But for the first time since Mrs. Pemberton had thrown her out, she felt something other than despair. The ranch house appeared after what felt like hours, but was probably less than one, a solid structure of logs and stone that seemed to grow out of the landscape itself. Smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth within. A barn stood off to one side, and Sarah could see a few other outbuildings scattered around the property. "It's not much," Daniel said, pulling the wagon up to the front door, "but it's sturdy and warm." "It looks like heaven," Sarah said honestly, and was surprised to see what might have been a smile touch the corner of his mouth. He helped her down from the wagon, then led her inside. The interior was exactly what she'd expected from a bachelor rancher, functional, sparse, but clean. A large fireplace dominated one wall with a fire already crackling in the grate. The furniture was simple, but well made, and everything had the look of being cared for, even if it lacked a woman's touch. "Kitchen's through there," Daniel said, pointing to a doorway. "Your room would be upstairs, second door on the right. Why don't you go have a look while I bring in the supplies, then we'll get some food in you." Sarah climbed the narrow stairs, her legs shaky from cold and hunger. The room he'd indicated was small but clean, with a bed, a dresser, a small writing desk, and a window that looked out over the prairie. True to his word, there was a lock on the door with a key already in it. She sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the evening. How had she gone from freezing in a doorway, about to be assaulted by Jake Morrison, to sitting in a warm room with a lock on the door and the promise of honest work? It seemed too good to be true. And in Sarah's experience, things that seemed too good to be true usually were. "Ma'am," Daniel's voice came from downstairs. "Food's ready if you are." Sarah made her way back down to find the kitchen table set with bread, cheese, sliced meat, and a pot of what smelled like beef stew warming on the stove. Her stomach clenched painfully at the sight. "Sit," Daniel said, pulling out a chair for her. "Eat slowly. You've been without for too long, don't want to make yourself sick." Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She sat and forced herself to eat small bites, though every instinct screamed at her to devour everything in sight. Daniel sat across from her, nursing a cup of coffee and watching her with those storm-gray eyes. "The work," Sarah said between bites. "What exactly would you need me to do?" "Cooking, cleaning, laundry, mending," Daniel listed. "Basic housekeeping. I can manage for myself, but barely. And the place could use a proper cleaning. Haven't had time with the ranch work." "I can do that," Sarah said quickly. "I'm a hard worker, Mr. Briggs. I won't give you cause to regret this." "I'm sure you won't." He paused, then added, "And it's just Daniel. The Mr. Briggs makes me look around for my father, and he's been dead these past 10 years. "Daniel, then." Sarah took another small bite of bread, savoring the taste. "May I ask, why did you help me, really?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "You ever been to war, Miss Whitfield?" "No, of course not." "I have. Saw things that would turn your hair white, saw what happens when the strong prey on the weak, when might makes right, when decent folk turn their backs on suffering because it's easier than getting involved." He touched the scar on his face absently. "When I came back, I promised myself I wouldn't be that kind of man. Wouldn't walk past someone who needed help just because it wasn't my problem." "But you don't know me," Sarah insisted. "You don't know what they're saying about me in town, what I might have done." "I know what I saw," Daniel interrupted gently. "I saw Morrison forcing himself on a woman who was clearly desperate and alone. I saw you trying to maintain your dignity even when you had nothing. That tells me more about your character than any gossip from town ever could." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She would not cry in front of this man, would not show that kind of weakness.
I used to be a teacher, she said quietly. Before everything fell apart. What happened? Sarah hesitated, then decided she owed him at least some version of the truth. Mrs. Pemberton's nephew, Thomas, took an interest in me. I refused his advances. He didn't take it well. Started spreading stories saying I'd led him on that I was loose, a woman of questionable morals. In a town like Snow Ridge, that's all it takes. The school board let me go, said I was a bad influence on the children. Mrs. Pemberton evicted me, and suddenly I was poison. No one would hire me. No one would rent to me. Thomas Pemberton, Daniel said, his voice flat. Pompous little weasel who thinks his aunt's money makes him important. You know him. Had the misfortune. He tried to buy some of my cattle last year for half what they were worth. When I refused, he tried to suggest I didn't know what was good for me. Daniel's smile was sharp. I suggested he leave my property before I helped him understand what wasn't good for him. Haven't seen him since. Despite everything, Sarah found herself almost smiling. I wish I could have done the same. Different rules for women, Daniel acknowledged. Unfair ones. They sat in comfortable silence while Sarah finished eating. When she was done, she started to clear the dishes, but Daniel stopped her. Tomorrow, he said. Tonight you rest. You look dead on your feet. But tomorrow, he repeated firmly. There's water for washing in your room, and I'll find you something clean to wear. Your dress needs mending and washing. Sarah looked down at her torn, dirty dress and felt a flash of shame. I must look a fright. You look like someone who's been through hell and survived it, Daniel corrected. Nothing wrong with that. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a clean nightgown and a simple day dress. These were my sisters. She stayed here for a few months last year after her husband died before she moved back east to live with our aunt. Left some things behind. You're about her size. Sarah took the clothes gratefully. You've been very kind. I don't know how to thank you. Do the work you're hired for, that's thanks enough. Daniel moved toward the door, then paused. Lock your door tonight, Miss Whitfield. Not because you need to, but because I want you to feel safe. First good night's sleep is important. After he left, Sarah climbed the stairs to her room at least for now. She washed with the water from the pitcher changed into the clean nightgown, and slipped between sheets that smelled of lavender and soap. The bed was softer than anything she'd slept on at the boarding house, and the quiet of the ranch was so different from the constant noise of town. She got up once to check the lock on the door, turning the key and testing it. It held firm. Back in bed, she pulled the quilts up to her chin and stared at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened. This morning, she'd woken up in a doorway, half frozen and contemplating whether death might be preferable to what her life had become. Tonight, she was warm-fed and safe with the promise of honest work and fair wages. It seemed impossible, like a dream she might wake from at any moment. But the bed was real, the locked door was real, and the quiet breathing of the house around her was real. Daniel Briggs had offered her a chance at survival with no apparent strings attached. Men didn't do that in Sarah's experience. There was always a price, always an expectation, always a moment when kindness turned to demand. Yet Daniel had walked away, told her to lock her door, hadn't even tried to exact a goodnight kiss as payment for his generosity. It was baffling. It was suspicious. It was wonderful. Sarah closed her eyes and for the first time in weeks fell asleep without fear. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee and bacon drifting up from below. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was, the peace and warmth too foreign after so many nights of cold and terror. Then it all came back. Morris and Daniel, the ride through the snow, the locked door. Sarah dressed quickly in the day dress Daniel had provided. It fit well enough, though it was a bit loose in the waist. She pinned her hair up as best she could without proper pins, splashed water on her face, and made her way downstairs. Daniel was in the kitchen, standing at the stove and managing what looked like breakfast for a small army. He glanced up when she entered, and something in his expression softened. "Morning. Coffee's hot if you want some." "I should be cooking for you," Sarah protested. "That's what you hired me for." Starting tomorrow," Daniel said, flipping bacon with practiced ease. "Today you get your bearings. Learn where everything is, figure out what needs doing. Can't work efficient if you don't know your workspace." It made sense, but Sarah still felt guilty watching him serve her breakfast. The food was simple, but good bacon, eggs, biscuits with butter and jam, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. "You cook well for a bachelor," she observed. "Had to learn. Man can't live on jerky and hardtack forever, though Lord knows I tried." He sat across from her with his own plate. "After breakfast, I'll show you around the place. You'll need to know where everything is root cellar, smokehouse well. Then I've got to ride out to check on the cattle. Storms coming in a few days, need to make sure they're moved to shelter." "How can you tell about the storm?" Daniel gestured toward the window. "Sky's got that look. Pressure's dropping. And my shoulder aches took a bullet there at Antietam, never healed quite right. Better than a barometer for predicting weather." "You were at Antietam." Sarah knew of the battle, of course. Everyone did. Bloodiest single day in the war, they said. Among other places. His tone suggested this wasn't a topic he wanted to pursue, and Sarah respected that. Everyone had things they didn't want to talk about. After breakfast, true to his word, Daniel showed her around the ranch. The house was larger than it appeared from outside, with 3 bedrooms upstairs, a parlor that looked barely used, and a study filled with books that surprised her. The kitchen was well stocked, with a good stove and plenty of supplies laid in for winter. Outside, he showed her the barn, where 6 horses stayed, the chicken coop that provided fresh eggs, the smokehouse with its stores of preserved meat, and the root cellar filled with potatoes, turnips, carrots, and other vegetables that would last through the cold months. "You're entirely self-sufficient out here," Sarah observed. "Have to be. Town's 5 miles in good weather might as well be 50 in bad. Learn to provide for yourself or perish." He paused at the well, drawing up a bucket of water. "This is good water, clean and cold. Never runs dry even in drought years. It's quite an operation for one man. I have help during busy seasons. Few hands from town when I need them for roundup or branding. But winter's quiet. Just maintenance and keeping the stock alive." He looked at her sideways. "That's part of why I need household help. Can't be in 2 places at once, and the house suffers when I'm focused on the ranch." Sarah nodded, understanding. "I'll take good care of it, I promise." "I believe you will." He left after lunch, riding out to check his herd, leaving Sarah alone in the house. For a moment, she felt a flutter of panic. What if this was when everything changed? What if he came back different, demanding payment for his kindness? But the panic passed, replaced by determination. She had work to do, and she would do it well. She would prove herself useful, valuable even. She would earn her place here through honest labor. Sarah started with the kitchen, which was clean but could use a woman's touch. She scrubbed everything until it gleamed, reorganized the pantry, took inventory of supplies. Then she moved to the parlor, dusting furniture that probably hadn't been touched in months, beating rugs, washing windows until they sparkled. By the time Daniel returned near sunset, she'd transformed the main floor of the house. It still looked like a bachelor's residence, but now it was a clean, organized bachelor's residence. Daniel stood in the doorway, taking in the changes. "You've been busy. I hope you don't mind. I didn't move anything important, just cleaned and organized." "It looks good," he interrupted. "Better than it's looked in years. Smells better, too. Is that bread I smell?" Sarah flushed with pleasure. "I found flour and yeast, thought fresh bread would be nice with supper. Haven't had fresh bread since my sister left." He hung his coat and hat by the door, and Sarah noticed he was moving stiffly. "Are you hurt?" "Just cold. Shoulder acts up in this weather." He rolled the shoulder in question, wincing slightly. "Sit," Sarah said, moving to the stove. "I've got stew ready, and the bread's just about done. Hot food will help." She served him, and they ate together in comfortable silence. The bread was good if she said so herself, and Daniel ate 3 slices with obvious enjoyment. "This is excellent," he said. "You're already earning your wages." "About that," Sarah said carefully. "We haven't discussed what those wages would be." Daniel named a figure that made her blink. It was more than fair, it was generous. "Plus room and board, of course." "That's too much." "It's what the position's worth," Daniel said firmly. "Good help's hard to find out here. When you find it, you pay to keep it." Sarah wanted to argue, but she needed the money too badly. If she could save enough, maybe she could eventually leave Wyoming altogether, start fresh somewhere where no one knew her name or her shame. "Thank you," she said simply. "You're welcome." After supper, Daniel retired to his study, and Sarah finished cleaning the kitchen. She could hear him in there, the occasional rustle of pages turning. It was oddly domestic, comfortable in a way she hadn't expected. When she finally headed upstairs, she found something on her bed that hadn't been there that morning, a thick wool shawl beautifully made and a pair of sturdy boots that looked to be just her size. There was a note in Daniel's angular handwriting, "Found these in town today, figured you could use them. D." Sarah held the shawl to her chest, fighting back tears. When had anyone last shown her such simple, uncomplicated kindness? She couldn't remember. That night she locked her door again, but it felt more like habit than necessity. Whatever Daniel Briggs' motives for helping her, they didn't seem to include taking advantage. He was that rarest of creatures, a genuinely good man. Or at least that's what Sarah let herself believe as she drifted off to sleep warm and safe while the Wyoming wind howled outside. The days settled into a rhythm that Sarah hadn't expected to find so comforting. Each morning she woke before dawn to start breakfast timing it, so the coffee would be ready just as Daniel came in from his early chores. They'd eat together, discussing the day's plans with an ease that surprised them both. Then Daniel would head out to tend the ranch while Sarah kept the house, and they'd reconvene for supper to share the quiet companionship that had somehow sprouted between them like a stubborn plant in rocky soil. It had been 3 weeks since that night Daniel had found her in the snow, and Sarah still waited for the other shoe to drop. Surely no man could be this genuinely kind without expecting something in return. Yet Daniel maintained a respectful distance, never entering her room, never standing too close, never letting his hands linger when he helped her with heavy buckets or reaching high shelves. The storm he'd predicted arrived with a vengeance on a Tuesday afternoon. Sarah watched from his kitchen window as the sky turned an ominous green-gray and the wind began to howl like a living thing. Daniel had been out checking the cattle since dawn, making sure they were secured in the sheltered valley where they'd weather the worst of it. When he finally returned, he was covered in snow, his face red with cold. Sarah had hot coffee waiting and helped him out of his frozen coat, her fingers brushing against his as she took his gloves. Even through the cold, she felt a spark of something that made her step back quickly. "Thank you," he said, warming his hands around the mug. "It's going to be a bad one. We might be snowed in for a few days." "We have plenty of supplies," Sarah assured him. "I did inventory yesterday. We could last a month if needed." Daniel smiled, that rare expression that transformed his scarred face. "Always thinking ahead. You'd have made a good rancher's wife." The words hung in the air between them, and Sarah saw the moment Daniel realized what he'd said. Color crept up his neck, and he turned away suddenly, very interested in the view outside. I'll go check the barn doors," he muttered, setting down his barely touched coffee. "Daniel, wait." But he was already pulling his coat back on, escaping into the storm rather than face the awkwardness of his inadvertent admission. Sarah stood in the kitchen, her heart racing for reasons she didn't want to examine too closely. She'd been so focused on surviving, on proving her worth through work, that she hadn't let herself acknowledge the way her pulse quickened when Daniel smiled, or how she found herself looking for excuses to be in the same room as him, or how safe she felt not just in his house, but in his presence. The storm raged for 2 days, trapping them inside together. They played chess by the fire, Daniel teaching her the strategies he'd learned during long nights in army camps. He read to her from his collection of books, Dickens and Hawthorne, and even some Jane Austen that he claimed was his sister's, but which he seemed to know suspiciously well. Sarah mended his clothes and told him stories from her teaching days, carefully editing around the painful ending. On the second night of the storm, Sarah couldn't sleep. The wind was howling something fierce, and she could hear the house creaking under the assault. She wrapped herself in the shawl Daniel had given her and crept downstairs, thinking to make herself some warm milk. She found Daniel already in the kitchen, standing at the window and watching the snow swirl in the darkness. He turned when he heard her, and she saw something raw and haunted in his eyes. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly. "Storm brings back memories," he said, his voice rough. "The sound of wind. Sometimes it sounds like cannon fire, like men screaming." Sarah moved closer, not touching, but offering her presence. "Do you want to talk about it?" "No." Then softer. "Maybe. I don't know." He laughed bitterly. "I've never talked about it, not to anyone." "Sometimes it helps," Sarah offered. "Speaking the poison out loud can draw out its sting."
Daniel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't speak. Then, still staring out at the storm, he began. Antietam was bad, but it wasn't the worst. The worst was a place called Cold Harbor, June of '64. We charged Confederate positions that were impossible to take. Knew it was impossible, but orders were orders. 7,000 men fell in less than 20 minutes. The ground was so covered with bodies you couldn't walk without stepping on someone. His hand went unconsciously to his scarred face. That's where I got this. Grape shot from a cannon. Thought I was dead, wished I was dead lying there with half my face gone and my shoulder torn open. But I lived. Don't know why. Better men than me died that day. Boys who had families waiting, who had something to go home to. You had something to go home to, Sarah said gently. This ranch. Your sister. The ranch was my father's dream, not mine. And my sister, she had her own life, her own grief to deal with. He turned to look at her. Sometimes I think I came back wrong, like I left the best parts of myself on that battlefield and what came home was just the shell. Without thinking, Sarah reached out and took his hand. It was calloused and warm, and it trembled slightly in hers. You're not a shell, she said firmly. A shell wouldn't have stopped to help a desperate woman. A shell wouldn't have given her dignity and work and kindness expecting nothing in return. Whatever you think you lost at Cold Harbor, your goodness survived. Daniel stared at their joined hands as if he'd never seen such a thing before. You don't know what I've done. The things that happened in the war. We've all done things we're not proud of to survive, Sarah interrupted. That doesn't define us. Our choices now, how we treat others when we have the power to hurt them, that's what defines us. And you, Daniel Briggs, are one of the best men I've ever known. He turned his hand in hers, interlacing their fingers. Sarah, A massive crack of thunder shook the house, and they both jumped. The moment broken, Sarah pulled her hand away, wrapping the shawl tighter around herself. I should make that warm milk, she said, her voice too bright. Would you like some? Yes, Daniel said, after a pause. That would be nice. They drank their milk in companionable silence, the storm gradually dying down outside. When Sarah finally went back to bed, she could still feel the warmth of Daniel's hand in hers, and she knew something fundamental had shifted between them. The next morning brought clear skies and mountains of snow. Daniel threw himself into the work of digging out, and Sarah suspected he was avoiding the conversation they both knew was coming. She let him have his space, focusing on her own work, but the awareness between them was like a third presence in the house. It was late afternoon, the sun already starting its descent toward the horizon, when she heard the horses. Multiple horses moving fast through the snow. Sarah looked out the window and felt her blood turn to ice. Thomas Pemberton was riding up to the house accompanied by Jake Morrison and two other men she didn't recognize. They all wore guns, and their faces were set in expressions of grim determination. Daniel emerged from the barn rifle in hand, but held casually, not quite threatening, but clearly ready. Sarah watched from the window as the men dismounted. Thomas swaggering forward with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real opposition in his life. She couldn't hear what was being said, but she saw Thomas gesture toward the house, saw Daniel shake his head, saw Morrison's hand move toward his gun. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed her shawl and stepped outside. Ah, there she is, Thomas said, his voice carrying across the yard. Hello, Sarah. You've led us quite a chase. I haven't led you anywhere, Sarah said, pleased that her voice remained steady. I've been right here working for Mr. Briggs. Working, Morrison sneered. Is that what they're calling it now? Daniel shifted slightly, the movement placing him between Sarah and the men. State your business, Pemberton, or get off my land. My business is with Miss Whitfield, Thomas said smoothly. She owes my aunt 3 months back rent plus damages to the room. She also stole several items when she left. Says, I paid my rent and I stole nothing, Sarah said hotly. Your aunt threw me out with only the clothes on my back. That's not how my aunt tells it. And there's the matter of your inappropriate behavior with me, trying to seduce me for money, then slandering me when I refused. Thomas's smile was cold. I could have you arrested for prostitution and theft, unless, of course, we can come to some arrangement. Sarah felt sick. She knew what kind of arrangement Thomas had in mind, the same one he'd been trying to force on her for months. She's not going anywhere with you, Daniel said, his voice deadly quiet. I don't think you understand the situation, Briggs, Thomas said. I have witnesses to her crimes. Morrison here saw her propositioning men outside the saloon. My aunt will testify to the theft. She'll be convicted and sent to prison, unless she comes with me now and we discuss alternatives. Your witnesses are liars, and you know it, Daniel said.
And even if they weren't, you'd have to go through me to take her. Morrison laughed. 4 against 1, Briggs. You might be tough, but you ain't that tough. Want to find out? The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Sarah could see fingers twitching near guns, could feel violence brewing like another storm. She stepped forward despite Daniel's arm trying to hold her back. I'll go, she said quietly. Sarah, no. I won't have bloodshed on my account, she said, meeting Daniel's eyes. I won't have you hurt because of me. How touching, Thomas mocked. The whore has a conscience. The word had barely left his mouth when Daniel's fist connected with his jaw, sending Thomas sprawling in the snow. Morrison and the other men went for their guns, but Daniel already had his rifle up, and Sarah surprised everyone, including herself, by producing the small derringer Daniel had given her for emergencies from her apron pocket. Everyone calmed down, a new voice said, and they all turned to see Sheriff Watson riding up, accompanied by another man Sarah didn't recognize. Received some interesting information this morning that I thought I should investigate. Sheriff, Thomas said, getting to his feet and wiping blood from his mouth. This man assaulted me. I want him arrested. From what I saw, you had it coming, Watson said mildly, calling a lady names like that. But that's not why I'm here. He dismounted and pulled out a piece of paper. This here's a warrant for your arrest, Thomas Pemberton. What? That's absurd. 3 women in Cheyenne have come forward claiming you forced yourself on them. One of them's the mayor's daughter. Watson's expression was grim. They were too scared to speak up before, but when they heard what you did to Miss Whitfield here, trying to ruin her reputation, when she refused you, they found their courage. Thomas went pale. This is ridiculous. You can't believe. I can and I do. You're coming with me. Pemberton, Morrison, you and these other fellows can either ride along peaceful-like, or I can find reasons to arrest you too. Your choice. Morrison looked between Thomas and Daniel's rifle, then apparently decided discretion was the better part of valor. We're leaving, he muttered, helping a protesting Thomas onto his horse. As they rode away, Thomas twisted in his saddle to shout back at Sarah. This isn't over. You'll pay for this, you lying whore. Watson tipped his hat to Sarah. Ma'am, sorry for what you've been through. Those women in Cheyenne, they wanted me to tell you they're sorry they didn't speak up sooner. They said you were brave to refuse him. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. They came forward because of me. Your story traveled, ma'am. Sometimes all it takes is one person standing up to give others courage. He turned to Daniel. You take care of her, Briggs. She's been through enough. After the sheriff left, Sarah and Daniel stood in the yard, the sunset painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink. Sarah was shaking, reaction setting in now that the danger had passed. You pulled a gun, Daniel said, a note of wonder in his voice. You pulled a gun to defend me. You taught me how to use it, Sarah reminded him, and I wasn't going to let them hurt you. But you were going to let them take you. Sarah looked away. Better that than... No. Daniel gripped her shoulders gently, turning her to face him. Nothing is better than that. Don't you understand these weeks having you here? Sarah, you've brought life back to this place, to me. I was just existing before going through the motions, but you made me remember what it feels like to want to wake up in the morning to have someone to come home to. Daniel, I know I'm not much to look at, he continued, touching his scarred face self-consciously. And I know you've been hurt by men who should have protected you, but I need you to know that you're safe here. Not just from them, but from me too. I would never ask anything of you that you weren't willing to give. Never. Sarah reached up and covered his hand on his face with her own. Your scars don't make you less than you are. They're proof that you survived, that you're strong. And as for being safe, she took a breath, gathering courage. What if I don't want to be safe from you? What if I want more than safety? Daniel's eyes widened. Sarah, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. That's why I can. She stood on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his, a soft, tentative kiss that sent warmth flooding through her entire body. Daniel stood frozen for a moment, then his arms came around her, pulling her closer as he deepened the kiss. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." That night, for the first time, Sarah didn't lock her door. She lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling, waiting. When the soft knock came, she called out, "Come in." Daniel stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the lamplight from the hall. "I just wanted to say goodnight, and to tell you that nothing has to change unless you want it to." Sarah sat up, holding out her hand. "I want it to change. I want everything to change." He crossed the room and took her hand, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I'm not good with words, Sarah, but these weeks with you, you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope, purpose, a reason to build something instead of just maintaining what's already here." "You've given me the same," Sarah whispered. "You gave me dignity when everyone else tried to strip it away. You saw me as a person, not a problem or an opportunity. You gave me back myself." Daniel lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "I love you, Sarah Whitfield. I don't expect you to feel the same, but I needed you to know." Sarah's heart felt like it might burst. "I love you too, Daniel Briggs, scars and all." They came together then, two damaged souls finding healing in each other's arms. Outside, the Wyoming night stretched endless and cold, but inside the ranch house, warmth and love bloomed like spring flowers in winter snow. The next morning brought new challenges. News of Thomas Pemberton's arrest had spread through Snow Ridge like wildfire, and suddenly everyone had opinions about Sarah Whitfield and her situation. Some believed she'd been wronged and were eager to make amends. Others insisted she must have done something to encourage Thomas, that no smoke existed without fire. Daniel suggested they go to town together, face the gossip head on. "Running from it only makes it worse," he said. "Better to show them you have nothing to be ashamed of." Sarah agreed, though her stomach churned at the thought of facing all those judging eyes. She wore her best dress, actually Daniel's sister's best dress, that she'd altered to fit, and held her head high as they drove the wagon into town. The first stop was the general store, where Mrs. Henderson, who'd previously crossed the street to avoid Sarah, now greeted her with embarrassed enthusiasm. "Miss Whitfield, how wonderful to see you. I heard about that terrible business with the Pemberton boy. Always thought there was something off about him, I did." Sarah managed a polite smile, though she remembered clearly how Mrs. Henderson had been one of the first to spread the gossip about her. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. Will you be coming back to town? The school board's been looking for a new teacher since the position became available." "Miss Whitfield is quite happy in her current position," Daniel said firmly, his hand settling protective on Sarah's back. "She's not looking for a change." They completed their shopping with minimal fuss, though Sarah could feel eyes on them everywhere they went. Some looked curious, others sympathetic, and a few still hostile. Jake Morrison lounged outside the saloon, his gaze following them with barely concealed hatred. "He's going to be trouble," Sarah murmured. "Let him try," Daniel replied. "He's a coward at heart. Without Pemberton's money backing him, he's just another drunk with a mean streak." They were loading the wagon when Pastor Williams approached, his face grave. Sarah tensed, remembering how he'd refused to help her when she'd gone to the church, seeking shelter. "Miss Whitfield, Mr. Briggs, might I have a word?" "Say what you need to say, Pastor." Daniel said, his tone neutral, but not friendly. "I owe you an apology, Miss Whitfield. When you came to me in need, I turned you away. I let gossip and propriety override Christian charity. I failed you, and I failed my calling. I hope you can forgive me." Sarah studied his face, seeing what appeared to be genuine remorse. "I appreciate your apology, Pastor Williams. I forgive you." "Thank you. You're a gracious woman." He hesitated, then added, "If you and Mr. Briggs ever need anything, my door is open." As he walked away, Daniel muttered, "Easy to apologize now that the truth's out." "Maybe," Sarah agreed, "but at least he did apologize. That's more than most will do." They were about to leave town when a carriage pulled up, an expensive one that Sarah recognized with a sinking heart. Mrs. Pemberton stepped out, her face set in lines of aristocratic displeasure. So, she said, looking Sarah up and down, you're the one who's ruined my nephew. Your nephew ruined himself, Daniel said before Sarah could respond. Your niece just refused to be another victim. Mrs. Pemberton's gaze shifted to him. And you're the rancher who's taken her in. Tell me, Mr. Briggs, what exactly is the nature of your arrangement? The nature of our arrangement is none of your business, Daniel said evenly. But if you must know, Miss Whitfield is my housekeeper. She works for wages, and she's the best help I've ever had. Housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton said, her tone making it clear what she thought of that claim. How convenient. Sarah found her voice. More convenient than being thrown into the street in winter with nothing but the clothes on my back. More convenient than being slandered and destroyed because I wouldn't submit to your nephew's advances. Yes, Mrs. Pemberton. I suppose it is convenient to have honest work and a safe place to live. The older woman's face flushed. You always were too proud for your station, a schoolteacher putting on airs thinking yourself better than you were. I never thought myself better than anyone, Sarah said quietly. I just thought myself deserving of basic respect and dignity. Your nephew disagreed. Now he'll face the consequences of that disagreement. This isn't over, Mrs. Pemberton said, echoing her nephew's threat. I have influence in this territory. I can make things very difficult for both of you. You can try, Daniel said, his hand moving to rest on the gun at his hip. But I'd think carefully before starting a war with me, Mrs. Pemberton. I've been to war. I know how to fight one. Do you? Something in his eyes must have convinced her because Mrs. Pemberton stepped back, her bravado faltering. We'll see about this, she muttered, but it sounded more like retreat than threat. As they drove home, Sarah was quiet, processing everything that had happened. The confrontations had gone better than expected, but she knew this wasn't the end. People like the Pembertons didn't give up easily, and Morrison was still out there nursing his grudges. You're worried, Daniel observed. They won't let this go. People like that, they can't stand losing. They'll find a way to strike back. Probably, Daniel agreed, but we'll be ready for them, together. Together. The word warmed Sarah more than the afternoon sun. She'd been alone for so long, fighting her battles single-handed. The idea of having someone beside her, someone strong and steady and true, seemed almost too good to believe. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Daniel surprised her by pulling out a small velvet box. This was my mother's, he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold ring with a small sapphire. She gave it to me before she died, told me to give it to the woman I wanted to spend my life with. Sarah's breath caught. Daniel? I know it's too soon. I know you might not be ready. But I want you to know that I'm serious about this about us. You don't have to answer now. You don't have to answer ever if you don't want to. But I wanted you to know where I stand. Sarah looked at the ring, then at Daniel's scarred, earnest face. She thought about all the reasons she should say no, the gossip it would cause, the judgment she'd face, the risk of trusting someone with her heart after everything she'd been through. Then she thought about waking up to Daniel's smile every morning, about the way he looked at her like she was precious, about the safety and warmth she'd found in his arms. She thought about building a life with someone who saw her strength instead of her shame. Yes, she said softly. Daniel blinked. Yes, I'll marry you, Daniel Briggs, scars and all. His face transformed with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. When? He asked, pulling her into his arms. Soon, Sarah said, thinking of Mrs. Pemberton's threats. The sooner we're married, the less ammunition they have against us. A married woman has more protection under the law than an unmarried one. Practical as always, Daniel teased, but his eyes were serious. We could go to the judge tomorrow if you want, or wait, and have the pastor do it, make it official in the church. Sarah considered. A church wedding would be a public declaration, a way of showing the town that she wasn't ashamed that she had nothing to hide, but it would also give their enemies time to plan to interfere. The judge tomorrow, she decided. We can have a church blessing later if we want, but I want the legal protection as soon as possible. Daniel kissed her forehead. Tomorrow it is future Mrs. Briggs. That night, Sarah lay in Daniel's arms, feeling safer than she'd ever felt in her life. Tomorrow, She would become his wife, gaining not just a new name, but a new standing in the community, Mrs. Daniel Briggs would have protections that Miss Sarah Whitfield never could. But more than that, she would have a partner, someone to face whatever came with. The Pembertons and Morrisons of the world might still try to hurt them, but they would face them together. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent. Sarah listened to Daniel's heartbeat steady and strong beneath her ear and thought about how far she'd come from that desperate night in the doorway. She'd thought she was at the end of everything then, but it had really been a beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, she knew. The Pembertons wouldn't accept defeat easily, and there would be those in town who would never fully accept her redemption. But tonight, wrapped in the arms of the man who'd seen her worth, when everyone else saw only scandal, Sarah allowed herself to believe in happy endings. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the Wyoming winter raged on, but inside the ranch house, love had built a shelter stronger than any storm. The morning of their wedding dawned clear and cold, with frost painting delicate patterns on the windows. Sarah stood before the small mirror in her room, pinning up her hair with trembling fingers. She wore the best dress from Daniel's sister's collection, a deep blue wool that brought out her eyes. It wasn't a wedding dress, but it was clean and respectable, and that was more than she'd had a month ago. Daniel knocked softly on her door. "Ready?" She opened it to find him dressed in his best suit, the one he probably wore to church on the rare Sundays he attended. He'd trimmed his beard and his hair was neatly combed, and despite the scar that marked his face, Sarah thought she'd never seen a more handsome man. "You look beautiful," he said softly, his eyes warm with admiration. "You clean up pretty well yourself," she replied, smoothing an imaginary wrinkle from his jacket. They stood there for a moment, the magnitude of what they were about to do settling over them like morning mist. Then Daniel offered her his arm. "Shall we go get married, Miss Whitfield?" "I thought you'd never ask Mr. Briggs." The ride to town felt both endless and far too quick. Sarah's mind raced with everything that could go wrong. What if the judge refused? What if Mrs. Pemberton had already poisoned him against them? What if Thomas had somehow gotten free and was waiting for them? Daniel seemed to sense her anxiety because he reached over and took her hand, squeezing gently. "Whatever happens, we face it together." The courthouse was quiet when they arrived. Most of the town's business not starting until later in the morning. Judge Harrison was in his office reviewing papers with a cup of coffee at his elbow. He looked up when they entered, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Daniel Briggs, haven't seen you in my courthouse since that dispute over water rights 2 years ago." His gaze shifted to Sarah, and his expression grew more serious. "Miss Whitfield, I heard about your troubles, nasty business with the Pemberton boy." "That's part of why we're here, Judge," Daniel said. "We want to be married, today if possible." Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose. "Rather sudden, isn't it?" "We've known each other long enough to know our minds," Daniel replied steadily. "And given the circumstances, we'd prefer not to wait." The judge studied them both, his keen eyes taking in the way they stood close together, the protective angle of Daniel's body, the quiet dignity in Sarah's posture despite everything she'd endured. "Marriage is a serious commitment," he said finally, "not something to be entered into lightly or as a mere legal convenience." "With respect, Judge," Sarah spoke up, "nothing about my life these past weeks has been convenient. Mr. Briggs offered me shelter when I had none work, when no one would hire me, and respect when the whole town was content to see me as ruined. If that's not a foundation for marriage, I don't know what is." Judge Harrison smiled slightly. "Well said." He pulled out the necessary papers. "I'll need witnesses. My clerk can serve as one, but you'll need another." "I'll stand witness." They all turned to see Dr. Marcus Webb standing in the doorway. The elderly physician had been Snow Ridge's doctor for 20 years, delivering babies and setting bones and seeing the town through everything from influenza outbreaks to mining accidents. "Doc Webb," Daniel said, surprised. "What brings you here?" "Heard you two were planning to make it official. Thought you might need a friendly face." He winked at Sarah. "Besides, I delivered you Miss Whitfield. Seems fitting I should see you properly married." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She'd forgotten that doctor. Webb had been the one to bring her into the world 24 years ago, back when her parents were still alive and respectable members of the community. "Thank you," she whispered. The ceremony was simple and brief. Judge Harrison read the legal words while Sarah and Daniel stood before his desk, hands clasped. When it came time for the vows, Daniel's voice was strong and clear. I, Daniel, take you, Sarah, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health for richer or poorer, for better or worse, from this day forward until death do us part. Sarah's voice trembled only slightly as she repeated the words back to him. When Judge Harrison pronounced them man and wife, Daniel kissed her, gently mindful of their audience, but unable to hide the joy in his eyes. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Briggs, Judge Harrison said, signing the marriage certificate with a flourish. May you have many happy years together. They were walking out of the courthouse, Dr. Webb having taken his leave after offering his best wishes, when they nearly collided with Mrs. Pemberton and her lawyer, a thin, sharp-faced man named Garrett. So it's true, Mrs. Pemberton said, her face tight with fury. You've actually married her. Good morning to you too, Mrs. Pemberton, Daniel said mildly. Yes, I've married her. May I present my wife, Mrs. Sarah Briggs? The possessive pride in his voice when he said, my wife, made Sarah's heart skip, but she kept her expression calm as she faced her former landlady. This changes nothing, Mrs. Pemberton hissed. She still owes me 3 months' rent and damages. I'll see her in court for it. Actually, Mr. Garrett interjected, looking uncomfortable. It does change things. As a married woman, her debts become her husband's responsibility, and Mr. Briggs here is well known for paying his debts promptly. Then he can pay what she owes. I'd be happy to, Daniel said easily, once you provide an itemized list of these supposed damages and proof that rent wasn't already paid. I'm sure you keep excellent records, Mrs. Pemberton. The judge will want to see them. Mrs. Pemberton's face went red. Sarah knew as well as anyone that the woman kept terrible records, often collecting rent twice, from confused tenants or inventing damages to keep security deposits. Furthermore, Daniel continued, my wife tells me she left several personal items in her room when you evicted her without proper notice. Family photographs, letters, some jewelry that belonged to her mother. We'll be expecting those returned. Those items were confiscated against the debt. Which hasn't been proven in court, Daniel interrupted smoothly. So that would be theft, wouldn't it, Mr. Garrett? The lawyer cleared his throat. Technically, yes. Mrs. Pemberton, perhaps we should discuss this privately before pursuing any legal action. As they walked away, Mrs. Pemberton shot them a venomous look over her shoulder. Sarah knew this wasn't over, but for now they'd won this round. Family photographs? She asked Daniel quietly as they climbed into the wagon. You mentioned once that you had a picture of your parents. Figured she had no right to keep it, debt or no debt. Sarah's throat tightened with emotion. She had mentioned it just once in passing weeks ago, that he'd remembered that he'd thought to fight for something so personally valuable to her meant more than she could express. Word of their marriage spread through Snow Ridge like wildfire. By the time they stopped at the general store for supplies, it seemed half the town knew. The reactions were mixed. Some offered genuine congratulations, others whispered behind their hands, and a few looked at them with open disapproval. Don't let them bother you, Daniel murmured as they passed a group of women who fell silent at their approach. I'm not bothered, Sarah said, and realized it was true. She was Mrs. Daniel Briggs now. She had a husband who loved her, a home that was truly hers, and legal protection that no amount of gossip could strip away. They were loading the last of their supplies when Jake Morrison appeared whiskey-heavy on his breath, despite the early hour. Well, well. The whore found herself a husband. Tell me, Briggs, does she perform for you the way she did for Pemberton? Daniel moved so fast, Sarah barely saw it. One moment, Morrison was standing there sneering. The next, he was on the ground with Daniel's boot on his throat. That's my wife you're talking about, Daniel said, his voice deadly calm. Insult her again and I'll kill you. That's not a threat, Morrison. It's a promise. Sheriff Watson appeared then, drawn by the commotion. Problem here, gentlemen. No problem, Sheriff, Daniel said, removing his boot from Morrison's throat. Mr. Morrison just tripped. Probably the whiskey. He was just leaving. Morrison scrambled to his feet, his face purple with rage and humiliation. This ain't over, Briggs. It is unless you want it to end with you in the ground, Daniel replied evenly. After Morrison slunk away and the sheriff moved on, Sarah touched Daniel's arm. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. You're my wife now. No one speaks to you that way. Not ever. The ride home was quiet, both of them processing the events of the morning. As they pulled up to the ranch house, Sarah realized it looked different somehow. It took her a moment to understand why this wasn't just Daniel's house anymore. It was their home. That evening, as Sarah prepared dinner in what was now her kitchen in more than just practice, she heard horses approaching. Daniel went to the window, his hand moving automatically to his rifle. Riders coming, 3 of them. Sarah joined him at the window, her heart sinking as she recognized the lead rider. It's Royce Blackwell. She'd hoped never to hear that name again, let alone see the man himself. Royce Blackwell was Thomas Pemberton's cousin from Denver, a man with connections to judges, politicians, and worse. If he was here, it meant the Pembertons were escalating. Stay inside, Daniel said, checking his rifle. No. Sarah lifted her chin. We face this together, remember? Daniel looked like he wanted to argue, then nodded. Together. They stepped out onto the porch as Royce and his men dismounted. Royce was everything his cousin wasn't tall, handsome in a cold way, impeccably dressed, and utterly ruthless. His dark eyes fixed on Sarah with an expression that made her skin crawl. Miss Whitfield, or should I say Mrs. Briggs now, how quickly you've risen from the gutter. State your business, Blackwells, Daniel said, his rifle held casually but ready. My business is with your wife. She's caused my family considerable embarrassment. My cousin sits in jail because of her lies. They weren't lies, Sarah said firmly. Your cousin is in jail because he's a predator who finally got caught. Royce's smile was thin and dangerous. That's a matter of perspective. My perspective is that you're a scheming woman who entrapped my cousin and then destroyed his reputation when he rejected you. Your perspective is wrong. Perhaps, but I have something that might change your mind. He pulled out a document from his coat. A sworn affidavit from one Martha Coleman stating that she saw you entering Thomas's room at the boarding house on multiple occasions, dressed inappropriately and clearly offering yourself to him. Sarah gasped. Martha Coleman had been another tenant at the boarding house, a bitter woman who'd resented Sarah for being younger and prettier. That's a lie I never... Can you prove it's a lie? Can you prove you never entered his room because Martha's willing to testify in court? As are several other witnesses I've located who will swear to your loose morals in pursuit of my cousin. Bought witnesses, Daniel said with disgust. Prove it, Royce challenged. In the meantime, I'm prepared to bring charges against your wife for slander, defamation, and false accusation. The trial will be very public, very messy. Every detail of her past will be examined. Every man she's ever smiled at will be questioned. By the time it's over, her reputation won't just be damaged, it will be destroyed beyond any redemption. What do you want? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. I want you to recant your accusations against Thomas, publicly. Admit you lied that you pursued him, and he rejected you, and that you made up the assault claims out of spite. Do that, and all of this goes away. She's not lying to save your worthless cousin, Daniel said flatly. Then she'll be destroyed, and you along with her Briggs. I have considerable influence in this territory. I can make sure you never sell another head of cattle, never get another loan from a bank, never buy supplies from any merchant in 300 miles. I can ruin you both. You can try, Daniel said, but Sarah heard the concern beneath his bravado. They both knew Royce probably could do exactly what he threatened. I'll give you 3 days to decide, Royce said, mounting his horse again. After that, I file charges and begin proceedings. Choose wisely, Mrs. Briggs. Your husband's future depends on it. After they left, Sarah sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. He'll do it. He'll destroy us both. Let him try, Daniel said fiercely. We'll fight him. With what he has money influence bought witnesses. We have nothing but the truth, and we both know how little that's worth in a court when the other side has deeper pockets. Daniel knelt beside her chair, taking her hands. We have each other. We have friends, Doc Webb, Judge Harrison. Hell, even Sheriff Watson seems to be on our side. And we have the other women who came forward about Thomas. They won't let you stand alone. You don't understand. Sarah said desperately. Men like Royce Blackwell don't lose. They destroy anyone who stands against them. I've seen it happen. I won't let him destroy you too. Maybe I should— Don't you dare finish that sentence, Daniel interrupted. You're not sacrificing yourself for me. We're married now, for better or worse. Remember, this is the worst part. We weather it together. That night, neither of them slept well. Sarah lay awake thinking about Royce's threats about the trial he'd threatened, about having every moment of her life dissected in public. She thought about Daniel losing his ranch, his livelihood, everything he'd worked for, all because he'd been kind to a desperate woman. Stop it, Daniel said in the darkness. Stop what? Stop thinking about leaving to protect me. I can hear your mind working. Sarah turned to face him in the darkness. How did you know? Because I know you. You're thinking that if you disappear, Royce won't have any reason to come after me. You're thinking that you're not worth losing everything for. Aren't I right? No. He pulled her closer. You're worth everything, Sarah. The ranch, the cattle, all of it. It's just things. But you're my wife, the woman I love. That's worth fighting for. The next morning brought an unexpected ally. Mary Watson, the sheriff's wife, arrived just after breakfast with two other women, Helen Barnes, the banker's wife, and surprisingly, Amanda Morrison, Jake Morrison's younger sister. We heard about Royce Blackwell's visit, Mary said without preamble. We're here to help. Sarah blinked in surprise. I don't understand. Every woman in this town has a story about the Pemberton men, Helen said grimly. Thomas, his father, before him now, this cousin. They think they can take whatever they want, destroy whoever stands against them. Thomas cornered me behind the church once, Amanda said quietly. If my brother hadn't come along— Well, Jake's got his faults, but he protected me that day. He doesn't know I'm here, and he'd be furious if he did, but I can't stand by and watch them destroy you for telling the truth. We're going to gather statements, Mary announced. Every woman who's had an encounter with Thomas or his family, every witness to their behavior. We're going to build a wall of testimony that even Royce Blackwell can't buy his way through. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. Why would you do this for me? Because if we don't stand together, we fall separately, Helen said simply. Today it's you. Tomorrow it could be any of us or our daughters. Over the next 2 days, the women of Snow Ridge quietly mobilized. Stories that had been whispered in kitchens and parlors for years were finally documented. The minister's daughter, who'd been grabbed behind the schoolhouse. The seamstress who'd been propositioned with threats. The hotel maid who'd quit rather than endure Thomas's advances. By the time Royce's deadline arrived, they had 15 sworn statements from respectable women, all detailing patterns of predatory behavior from Thomas Pemberton. Royce arrived at the ranch precisely at noon on the third day this time, with more men, 5 in total, all armed. But he pulled up short when he saw the crowd gathered in the yard. Not just Daniel and Sarah, but Sheriff Watson, Judge Harrison Doc Webb, and a dozen women from town, including the mayor's wife herself. What is this? Royce demanded. This is the community standing with Mrs. Briggs, Judge Harrison said calmly. I've reviewed the statements gathered over the past 3 days. 15 women have come forward with accounts of your cousin's inappropriate behavior. Their testimony far outweighs one questionable affidavit from Martha Coleman, who I've learned owes your aunt a considerable sum in gambling debts. You can't prove— Actually, I can, Sheriff Watson interrupted. Had a very interesting conversation with Martha this morning. She admitted you paid her to lie. That's subordination of perjury, Mr. Blackwell, a serious crime. Royce's face had gone pale, but his eyes remained dangerous. You think you've won. I have resources you can't imagine. I'll bury you all. No, you won't. Everyone turned to see an elegant carriage approaching, and Sarah gasped as she recognized the woman who stepped out. Charlotte Pemberton, not Thomas's aunt, but his mother who'd been traveling in Europe for the past year. Mother, Royce said, clearly shocked. What are you doing here? Cleaning up the mess you and my son have made, Charlotte said coldly. She was a regal woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. I returned from Paris to find my son in jail and my nephew threatening innocent people. She turned to Sarah. Mrs. Briggs, I owe you an apology. I've known about my son's proclivities for years. I hoped sending him to stay with his aunt would help him grow up, but clearly I was wrong. I should have dealt with this long ago. Mrs. Pemberton, Royce started. Silence, Charlotte snapped. You're done here, Royce. You'll return to Denver immediately, and you'll drop all threats against Mrs. Briggs. If I hear you've so much as looked in her direction again, I'll cut off your allowance and ensure you never work in any business our family has connections to. You can't. I can, and I will. The Pemberton fortune comes from my father, not your uncle. I control the purse strings, and you'd do well to remember that. She turned back to Sarah. My son will be tried fairly for his crimes. I won't interfere with justice. What he's done is inexcusable, and he'll face the consequences. Thank you. Sarah managed, still stunned by this turn of events. Charlotte nodded regally. I'll also be speaking to my sister-in-law about her behavior. Throwing a young woman into the street in winter is unconscionable, regardless of the circumstances. She looked at Daniel. Mr. Briggs, you have my respect for standing by your wife. Not many men would have had the courage. She's worth standing by, ma'am. Charlotte smiled slightly. Indeed. Good day to you both. Come, Royce. We have a long journey back to Denver, during which you'll explain exactly how you thought threatening innocent people would solve anything. As the carriages rolled away, Sarah felt her knees buckle. Daniel caught her, holding her steady as the crowd around them erupted in celebration. It's over, she whispered, hardly daring to believe it. It's over, Daniel confirmed, kissing her forehead. You're free, Sarah, truly free. That evening, their house was full of neighbors and friends, an impromptu celebration of victory over the Pemberton influence that had shadowed Snow Ridge for so long. Women hugged Sarah with tears in their eyes, thanking her for being the catalyst that finally brought their stories to light. Men shook Daniel's hand, respecting him for standing by his wife against powerful enemies. As the sun set and their guests finally departed, Sarah and Daniel stood on their porch watching the stars emerge in the clear Wyoming sky. You know what I want to do now? Sarah asked. What's that? I want to live, really live. Not just survive or hide or fight to exist. I want to build something here with you. A real life, maybe even a family someday. Daniel pulled her close. That sounds perfect, Mrs. Briggs. I think I'd like to start a school, Sarah continued, warming to the idea. Not in town, but here on the ranch. For the children of the surrounding farms and ranches who can't make it to town regularly. I could teach them, give them the education they deserve. We could build a schoolhouse, Daniel said, already planning, near the main road so it's easy for families to reach, with a proper stove for winter and windows for light. And books, Sarah added eagerly. Lots of books, and maps, and slate boards, and everything a real school needs. Whatever you want, Daniel promised. We'll build it together. They stood there in the gathering darkness, planning their future, the nightmare of the past weeks finally behind them. Sarah thought about that desperate night when she'd stood in a doorway ready to trade anything for simple survival. Now she had so much more love, respect, community, and the freedom to dream beyond mere existence. Daniel, she said softly. Yes? Thank you. For everything. For seeing me when I couldn't even see myself. Thank you, he replied. For reminding me that there's more to life than just getting through each day. For bringing light back into this place. As they went inside their home, truly, their home now, Sarah felt the last of her old life fall away like a shed skin. She was no longer Sarah Whitfield, the disgraced teacher, the woman with no options. She was Sarah Briggs, wife, future teacher again, member of a community that had finally stood up for what was right. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows slightly, but the house stood strong against it. Like their marriage, like their love, it was built to weather whatever storms might come. In the months that followed, they would build that schoolhouse, and children would come from miles around to learn from Mrs. Briggs, who had a gift for making even the dullest subjects come alive. Thomas Pemberton would be convicted and sent to prison, his mother ensuring he faced justice for his crimes. The women of Snow Ridge would continue to meet, forming a society for the protection and advancement of women's rights in the territory. But all of that was still to come. Tonight, Sarah lay in her husband's arms, listening to his heartbeat, and marveled at how sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the best. She'd lost everything, her reputation, her home, her position, only to gain something far more valuable, A love built on respect, a partnership built on trust, and a future built on the solid foundation of two people who'd seen each other at their worst and chosen to build something better together. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the ranch house all was warmth and peace. Sarah closed her eyes and smiled, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it with Daniel by her side. She'd thought she was trading herself for mere shelter that desperate night, but instead she'd found her home. Spring came slowly to Wyoming that year, the snow reluctant to release its grip on the prairie. Sarah stood at the window of what would soon be the schoolhouse, watching Daniel and 3 hired men from town raising the final wall. The structure was modest but solid, built with the same care Daniel put into everything he did. She pressed her hand to her stomach, feeling the slight swell that wasn't yet visible beneath her dress, and smiled at the secret she'd been carrying for 2 weeks now. She hadn't told Daniel yet, waiting for the right moment, but with each passing day, the joy of it threatened to burst from her like spring flowers through snow. A child. Their child. Living proof that life could bloom from the ashes of destruction. Mrs. Briggs? Sarah turned to see young Timothy Fletcher running up the path, his face flushed with excitement. The 12-year-old had been her first student when word spread that she was teaching again, his parents eager for him to learn despite the 5-mile journey from their farm. "Timothy, what brings you here so early? Lessons don't start until Monday. Ma sent me with news from town." The boy panted, catching his breath. "That man Jake Morrison, he's been going around saying terrible things. Says he's got proof that you and Mr. Briggs aren't really married, that the whole thing's a sham to cover up. Well, to cover up improper things." Sarah's blood chilled. She'd thought Morrison had given up after Royce Blackwell's defeat, but apparently his hatred ran deeper than she'd realized. "What kind of proof does he claim to have?" "Don't know, ma'am, but he's got folks listening. Even showed some paper to Mr. Henderson at the general store. Ma thought you should know right away." "Thank you, Timothy. Tell your mother I'm grateful for the warning." After the boy left, Sarah walked slowly to where Daniel was working, her mind racing. What could Morrison possibly have? Their marriage was legal, recorded at the courthouse, witnessed by respected members of the community. Daniel saw her approaching and immediately sensed something was wrong. He climbed down from the scaffolding, his face creased with concern. "What is it?" She told him about Timothy's news, watching his jaw tighten with each word. When she finished, Daniel was quiet for a long moment, then called to his workers. "Boys, we're done for today. I need to head into town." "I'm coming with you," Sarah said immediately. "Sarah, we face things together, remember? That was our agreement." Daniel nodded, though she could see he wanted to protect her from whatever ugliness Morrison was spreading. They hitched up the wagon and made the journey to Snow Ridge in tense silence, both preparing for whatever battle awaited them. The town was buzzing with gossip when they arrived. Sarah could feel eyes on them as they made their way down Main Street, could hear whispers following in their wake. They found Morrison holding court outside the saloon, a group of men gathered around him as he waved a piece of paper. "There they are," Morrison called out as they approached. "The great pretenders themselves. Come to defend your sham marriage, Briggs." "State your business, Morrison," Daniel said evenly, though Sarah could see his hands clenching at his sides. "My business is exposing liars and frauds," Morrison announced loudly enough for half the street to hear. "This here's a telegram from the courthouse in Cheyenne. Seems there's no record of a marriage license being filed for one Daniel Briggs and Sarah Whitfield." Sarah's heart dropped. The marriage license. In all the chaos with Royce Blackwell, they'd never filed the official copy with the territorial capital. It was still legal. Judge Harrison had the authority to perform marriages, but without the territorial filing, someone could challenge its validity. "Judge Harrison married us," Daniel said firmly. "Ask him yourself." "Oh, I did." Morrison smiled nastily. "Funny thing, though, the good judge left town yesterday to visit his sick brother in California. Won't be back for weeks. Convenient, isn't it? We have witnesses. Doc Webb, who's been sweet on the schoolmarm since she was born, not exactly impartial testimony." Morrison turned to address the growing crowd. "Face it, folks, they're not really married. She's just his kept woman, and they're trying to fool us all with this respectable act." "That's a lie." Sarah stepped forward, her anger overcoming her caution. "We were legally married by Judge Harrison. You're just bitter because what? Because I told the truth about what you are." Morrison's eyes glinted with malice.
You know what I think? I think Briggs here felt sorry for. You took you in and you seduced him into this fake marriage to protect your reputation. The crowd was murmuring now, uncertainty rippling through them. Some of the women who'd supported Sarah were looking troubled, and she could see doubt creeping into faces that had been friendly moments before. If it's a real marriage, Morrison continued playing to his audience. Where's the proof? Where's the certificate? Why wasn't it filed properly? The certificate is at the ranch, Daniel said, his voice tight with controlled anger. How convenient. A piece of paper no one's seen for a marriage no one attended except two carefully chosen witnesses, one of whom is conveniently gone. Morrison's smile widened. Unless you can produce that certificate and prove it's real, I'd say you've been living in sin, Mrs. Briggs. Or should I say, Miss Whitfield? Daniel moved so fast that Morrison didn't have time to react. His fist connected with Morrison's jaw, sending the man sprawling in the dirt. Morrison's friend started forward, but Daniel already had his gun drawn. Anyone else want to insult my wife? Daniel, no. Sarah caught his arm. This isn't the way. Sheriff Watson arrived then, having heard the commotion. What's going on here? Morrison struggled to his feet, blood streaming from his nose. Briggs assaulted me. I want him arrested. From what I saw, you provoked him with false accusations, Watson said mildly. Hard to blame a man for defending his wife's honor. She's not his wife, Morrison sputtered. They can't prove. We'll prove it. Sarah interrupted, her voice clear and strong. Give us 1 day. Tomorrow at noon we'll present our marriage certificate in front of the whole town. Anyone who wants to examine it can do so. And if you can't, Morrison challenged, then you can say whatever you want about us. Sarah replied, meeting his gaze steadily. But when we do prove it, you'll apologize publicly and never speak a word against us again. Morrison's smile was ugly. Deal. But when you can't produce that certificate, you'll leave town, both of you. As they drove back to the ranch, Daniel was grimly silent. Sarah knew what he was thinking. The marriage certificate was indeed at the ranch, locked in Daniel's desk, but would it be enough? Without Judge Harrison to verify it, without the territorial filing, Morrison could claim it was forged. We should have filed it properly, Daniel said finally. I should have made sure. We were dealing with Royce Blackwell, Sarah reminded him. We had other concerns. I failed to protect you. Again, you're being dragged through the mud because of my oversight. Sarah placed her hand over his on the reins. You haven't failed me. We'll figure this out. We always do. That night they sat at the kitchen table with the marriage certificate between them. It was official, legal, properly signed and witnessed. But would it be enough to convince a town that Morrison had been poisoning with doubt? We need the witnesses, Sarah said. Doc Webb might be sympathetic, but he's still respected. If he swears to the marriage, Morrison's already discredited him. And with Judge Harrison gone, Daniel rubbed his face tiredly. Maybe we should just leave. Start over somewhere else where nobody knows us. No. Sarah's voice was firm. I'm tired of running. This is our home. We built something here. I won't let Jake Morrison drive us away. Daniel looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. Then what do you suggest? Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then an idea struck her. The church registry. Pastor Williams offered to bless our marriage after the civil ceremony. We never took him up on it, but if he was willing to bless it, he must have believed it was real. Daniel finished, understanding dawning in his eyes. He keeps records of all marriages he's involved with, even blessings. And he mentioned making a note when we declined, saying we might want the blessing later. Sarah felt hope rising. If he has that note dated after our courthouse marriage, it's third-party proof that the marriage happened. They barely slept that night, waiting for dawn so they could ride to the parsonage. Pastor Williams received them in his study, listening gravely as they explained the situation. Morrison is a troubled soul, the pastor said when they finished. Bitter and lost. But yes, I have the note you mentioned. He pulled out a leather-bound ledger, flipping through pages. Here it is. March 15th. Offered blessing for the marriage of Daniel Briggs and Sarah Whitfield Briggs, performed by Judge Harrison on March 12th. Couple declined, but expressed interest in future blessing. Would you be willing to show this to the town? Sarah asked. More than that? Pastor Williams said, closing the ledger.
I'll bring it to the confrontation myself. And I think it's time we had that blessing, don't you? Make it doubly official. By the time noon arrived, it seemed the entire town had gathered in front of the general store. Morrison stood at the front, confident and smirking clearly, believing he'd won. Sarah noticed several of his gambling buddies nearby, probably hoping to profit from Daniel's downfall somehow. "Well, Morrison called out as Sarah and Daniel approached. "Where's this proof you promised?" Daniel held up the marriage certificate. "Right here, signed by Judge Harrison, witnessed by Dr. Webb and Mrs. Harper." "Could be forged," Morrison said loudly. "Without the judge here." "Which is why I brought this," Pastor Williams interrupted, stepping forward with his ledger. "My official church record noting the Briggs marriage 3 days after the ceremony. I offered to bless their union, which I could only do for a legally married couple." The crowd murmured, but Morrison wasn't finished. "That just proves you thought they were married. Doesn't mean, oh, for heaven's sake!" Everyone turned to see Charlotte Pemberton's carriage arriving. The elegant woman descended looking thoroughly irritated. "I returned to deal with the last of my family's affairs in this town," she announced, "and I find you're still persecuting this poor woman." She fixed Morrison with a withering stare. "I was present at the courthouse the day after their marriage, settling my nephew's accounts. I personally saw Judge Harrison's entry in the official record. They're legally married, and your vendetta is not only cruel but slanderous." "You could be lying to protect them," Morrison said desperately. Charlotte's eyebrows rose. "Are you calling me a liar, Mr. Morrison?" "Because I assure you my lawyers would be very interested in discussing that accusation." Morrison paled but pressed on. "Even if they're married, she's still a— Choose your next word very carefully." Daniel warned, his hand moving to his gun. "Perhaps," a new voice said, "I can settle this matter definitively." Everyone turned to see Judge Harrison himself stepping down from a stagecoach, looking tired but determined. "Judge," Sarah exclaimed, "we thought you were in California." "I was halfway there when I received a telegram about this nonsense. I turned around immediately." He surveyed the crowd with stern eyes. "I performed the marriage of Daniel and Sarah Briggs on March 12, 1884 at 10:30 in the morning. It was completely legal and properly witnessed. I have the duplicate certificate in my office, which I'll be happy to show anyone who doubts it." He turned to Morrison. "As for you, sir, spreading false accusations about a legal marriage is slander. I suggest you make that apology Mrs. Briggs requested and then find somewhere else to be, permanently." Morrison's face had gone from red to white to red again. The crowd was looking at him now with disapproval and disgust. Even his gambling buddies were edging away. "I apologize," he muttered. "Louder," Daniel said coldly, "so everyone can hear." "I apologize," Morrison shouted. "I was wrong. They're legally married." "And," Sarah prompted, "and I won't speak against you again." Morrison finished the words clearly painful. "Good," Sheriff Watson said, stepping forward. "Now I'm giving you 24 hours to leave town, Morrison. Your kind of trouble isn't welcome here anymore." As Morrison slunk away and the crowd dispersed, many people approached Sarah and Daniel to apologize for doubting them. The women who'd supported Sarah through the Blackwell confrontation were particularly ashamed, but Sarah graciously forgave them all. "Doubt is natural when lies are spread so vigorously," she said. "What matters is that truth prevailed." Pastor Williams approached them as the crowd thinned. "About that blessing. I think now would be the perfect time, don't you?" And so in front of the remaining townspeople, Pastor Williams blessed their marriage, making it official in the eyes of both law and church. When he finished, Daniel kissed Sarah in full view of everyone, a declaration that they were united and unashamed. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Sarah finally decided it was time to share her secret. "Daniel, I have something to tell you." He looked at her with concern. "What is it?" She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby." Daniel's eyes widened, his expression cycling through surprise, joy, and wonder in quick succession. "A baby? You're sure? Doc Webb confirmed it last week. I wanted to wait for the right moment to tell you." Daniel pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was made of spun glass. "A baby,"
he repeated, marvel in his voice. Our baby. Due in the fall, Sarah said, smiling at his reaction. The schoolhouse will be finished by then, and I can teach until I start showing too much. You'll have to take it easy, Daniel said immediately, already shifting into protective mode. No heavy lifting, no long days on your feet. Daniels. Sarah laughed. I'm pregnant, not made of porcelain. Women have been having babies while working since the beginning of time. Not my woman, Daniel said firmly. Not my child. You'll have the best of everything, all the help you need. Sarah kissed him softly. I already have everything I need. A home, a husband who loves me, work that fulfills me, and now a child on the way. 6 months ago, I was ready to die in that doorway. Now I have more than I ever dreamed possible. The next morning brought yet another surprise.
A well-dressed man arrived at the ranch introducing himself as Mr. Garrett, Charlotte Pemberton's lawyer. Mrs. Pemberton has instructed me to deliver this, he said, handing Sarah an envelope. Inside was a bank draft for a substantial sum and a letter in Charlotte's elegant handwriting, Mrs. Briggs. This money represents the inheritance your mother would have received from her father if certain financial irregularities hadn't occurred. Irregularities my late husband was partly responsible for. I cannot undo the past, but I can at least ensure you receive what should have been yours. Use it to build your school and your life. You've earned it through courage. I wish I'd had at your age. Charlotte Pemberton. Sarah stared at the bank draft in shock. It was enough to not just finish the schoolhouse, but to buy book supplies, everything needed to create a proper educational institution. I don't understand, she said to Mr. Garrett. My mother's inheritance. Your maternal grandfather was a business partner of Mr. Pemberton Sr. When he died, certain assets that should have gone to your mother were redirected. Mrs. Pemberton recently discovered this among her late husband's papers. She insists on making it right. After Garrett left, Sarah and Daniel sat in stunned silence, staring at the check. It's enough to build a proper school, Sarah said finally. Multiple rooms, a library, proper heating for winter. It's enough for more than that, Daniel pointed out. We could expand the ranch, build a proper house for when the baby comes. Our house is perfect, Sarah said firmly, but maybe we could add a room for the baby, and one for the books I want to collect. Daniel smiled. A library. My wife wants a library. Every home should have one, Sarah said with dignity. Especially a home where children will grow up. Children. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Plural? Sarah blushed. Well, I don't imagine this will be our only child. Daniel pulled her close. I like the sound of that. A whole house full of little Briggs children running around causing chaos. Learning to read in their mother's library, Sarah added. Working the ranch with their father, Daniel continued. Growing up free and safe and loved, Sarah finished softly. The schoolhouse was completed 2 weeks later, and Sarah's first class had 12 students ranging in age from 6 to 16. Word had spread about Mrs. Briggs' teaching, and families were willing to travel considerable distances to give their children an education. Sarah stood at the front of the classroom that first morning looking at the eager faces before her. Some were children of ranchers, others of farmers. One was the daughter of a former saloon girl who'd married a shopkeeper and desperately wanted better for her child. Welcome, Sarah said, her voice clear and warm. This is a place of learning where every child is equal and every mind is valued. We'll work hard, but we'll also discover the joy in learning. Who can tell me what they hope to learn this year? Hands shot up and Sarah's heart swelled. This was what she was meant to do, what she'd always been meant to do. Teaching wasn't just her profession. It was her calling. As spring turned to summer, Sarah's pregnancy became visible, causing another flutter of gossip in town. But this time the talk was different excitement about the Briggs baby, speculation about names, offers of help, and hand-me-down baby clothes. Mary Watson organized a quilting bee where the women of Snow Ridge gathered to make blankets and clothes for the baby. Even Amanda Morrison, whose brother had fled town in disgrace, came to help. I'm sorry for what Jake did, Amanda said quietly as they worked. He was always angry, but after the war it got worse. He couldn't let go of his rage. It's not your fault, Sarah assured her. We're not responsible for our family's choices, only our own. One afternoon in late July, Daniel surprised Sarah by leading her to a part of the house she rarely visited, the attic. "Close your eyes," he instructed, guiding her up the narrow stairs. When she opened them, she gasped. The attic had been transformed into a library. Shelves lined the walls, already partially filled with books. A comfortable reading chair sat by the window, with a small table beside it, perfect for a cup of tea and a lamp. "Daniel, how did you—" "I've been working on it in the evenings while you were preparing lessons," he admitted. "I wanted you to have a place that was entirely yours, somewhere you could escape when the baby's crying, and the students are demanding, and life gets overwhelming." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "It's perfect. But when did you learn carpentry like this?" "I've been learning a lot of things since you came into my life," Daniel said softly. "How to hope again. How to dream beyond the next season. How to build something that will last longer than we will." Sarah kissed him deeply, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. When they pulled apart, she was crying in earnest. "Pregnancy emotions, she said, laughing through her tears. "Beautiful emotions," Daniel corrected, wiping her cheeks gently. August brought a heat wave that made Sarah grateful the school was closed for summer. She spent her days preparing for the baby, organizing the nursery Daniel had built adjoining their bedroom, and writing in the journal she'd started keeping. One evening, as she wrote about their journey from that desperate night in the snow to this moment of quiet contentment, she felt the baby move for the first time. She gasped, her hand flying to her stomach. "Daniel!" He was beside her in an instant, alert for danger. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "No, no." She grabbed his hand, placing it on her belly. "Wait." They stood frozen for a moment, and then Daniel's eyes widened as he felt the flutter of movement beneath his palm. "Is that our baby?" Sarah confirmed, tears streaming down her face. "Our baby's saying hello." Daniel dropped to his knees, pressing his ear against her stomach. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "This is your papa. I want you to know you're already loved more than all the stars in the Wyoming sky." Sarah ran her fingers through his hair, overwhelmed by the tenderness of the moment. This man who'd been scarred by war, who'd lived alone for so long, who'd built walls around his heart, was on his knees talking to their unborn child with such gentle love, it took her breath away. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Taking in a desperate woman that night." "Your life was simpler before I complicated it." Daniel looked up at her with such intensity it made her heart skip. "My life was empty before you filled it. I was a ghost haunting my own existence. You brought me back to life, Sarah. You gave me purpose, love, a future. How could I regret the best thing that ever happened to me? Even with all the trouble, Morrison, the Pembertons, the gossip, especially with all that," Daniel said, firmly rising to his feet and pulling her into his arms. "It proved what we have is worth fighting for. It showed me I could still fight for something that mattered, that I hadn't lost that capacity in the war." As summer turned to autumn, Sarah's pregnancy progressed, and she had to stop teaching, turning the school over to a young woman from Cheyenne who'd answered their advertisement for an assistant teacher. Miss Collins was competent and enthusiastic, and Sarah felt comfortable leaving her students in her care. The leaves were turning gold and amber when Sarah's labor began 3 weeks earlier than Doc Webb had predicted. Daniel was out checking the cattle when the pains started, and Sarah tried not to panic as they quickly intensified. She managed to ring the bell they'd installed for emergencies, and within minutes one of the ranch hands was riding for town to fetch Doc Webb, while another went to find Daniel. By the time Daniel burst through the door, Sarah was gripping the bedpost, breathing through a particularly intense contraction. His face was white with fear, but his hands were steady as he helped her to the bed. "Doc Webb's coming," he said, smoothing her hair back from her sweating forehead. "You're going to be fine. You're the strongest woman I know." "I'm scared," Sarah admitted between contractions. "It's too early." "Not too early," Doc Webb said, arriving with reassuring efficiency. "Babies come when they're ready, not when we expect them, Mrs. Watson's downstairs boiling water, and everything looks perfectly normal." The labor was long and difficult, stretching through the night and into the next morning. Daniel never left Sarah's side, letting her grip his hand until her nails left marks, whispering encouragement when she thought she couldn't continue. "I can't," she gasped at one point, exhausted and overwhelmed. You can, Daniel said firmly. You survived being thrown into the winter streets. You stood up to the Pembertons and Morrison. You rebuilt your life from nothing. You can do this. And she did. As the sun rose on a crystal-clear September morning, Sarah and Daniel's daughter entered the world with a robust cry that brought tears of relief to everyone's eyes. A perfect little girl, Doc Webb announced, cleaning the baby and wrapping her in one of the quilts the women had made. Small, but healthy. She's a fighter like her mother. Daniel held his daughter for the first time with an expression of such wonder that Sarah started crying all over again. The baby was tiny in his large, scarred hands, but he held her like she was made of spun gold and starlight. "She's beautiful," he whispered. "Look at her, Sarah. We made this perfect little person." "What should we name her?" Sarah asked, reaching out to stroke the baby's downy head. "Hope," Daniel said without hesitation. "Hope Margaret Briggs. Because that's what you gave me and what she represents. Hope for the future." Hope Margaret Briggs grew strong despite her early arrival, thriving under the devoted care of her parents. Sarah recovered quickly, driven by a mother's fierce love and the need to return to her teaching. The school had become more than just a building where children learned their letters. It had become the heart of the rural community, a place where farm children could dream beyond the boundaries of their families' fields. It was a crisp October morning. Hope, barely 6 weeks old, and sleeping in a basket beside Sarah's desk when the past returned with a vengeance. Sarah was reviewing her students' compositions when she heard horses approaching, many horses moving with the purposeful rhythm of men on a mission. Through the window she saw them. Jake Morrison had returned, and he wasn't alone. With him rode 8 men, all armed, all wearing the hard expressions of hired guns. But it was the man leading them that made Sarah's blood turn to ice. Royce. Blackwell sat tall in his saddle, his dark eyes fixed on the schoolhouse with predatory intent. "Children," Sarah said, her voice carefully calm. "I want you all to move to the back of the room and sit on the floor. Stay quiet and don't move until I tell you." The students, sensing danger, obeyed without question. Sarah picked up Hope, holding her daughter close as she moved to the door. Her derringer was in her desk drawer, but she couldn't reach it without turning her back on whatever was about to happen. Royce dismounted his expensive boots, hitting the ground with deliberate thuds. "Mrs. Briggs, or should I say the former Miss Whitfield, we have unfinished business." "I thought your aunt made it clear you were to leave us alone," Sarah said, proud that her voice didn't shake. "My aunt is dead," Royce said flatly. "Carriage accident last month. Very tragic. And with her gone, there's no one to stop me from collecting what's owed." Sarah's heart sank. Charlotte Pemberton had been their protection against Royce's revenge. Without her, "My cousin Thomas died in prison last week," Royce continued, moving closer. "Killed by another inmate. They say he was targeted because of his crimes against women. You killed him as surely as if you'd put a knife in his heart yourself." "Thomas killed himself with his own actions," Sarah replied, clutching Hope tighter as the baby began to fuss. "Perhaps, but you see, I made him a promise. Family honor and all that. I promised I'd see you pay for destroying the Pemberton name." His smile was cold and sharp as winter wind. "Your husband's not here to protect you. It's just you, some children, and that bastard infant you're holding. She's not—" "Oh, I know all about your supposed marriage. Had my lawyers look into it. Interesting how quickly it all happened." "A desperate woman, a lonely rancher, a hasty ceremony. I wonder what really happened that night he took you from town." Morrison laughed an ugly sound. "I told you, Blackwell, she traded herself for shelter, then trapped Briggs into marriage when she got pregnant." Sarah heard gasps from her students and felt rage rise in her chest. "How dare you say such things in front of children?" "Children should know what kind of woman their teacher really is," Royce said. "But don't worry, after today you won't be teaching anyone anything." "What do you want?" Sarah demanded. "Justice. You're going to write a confession. Admit that you lied about Thomas, that you seduced him and then cried assault when he rejected you. Admit that your marriage to Briggs is a sham, that you're nothing but a whore who got lucky." "I'll do no such thing." "Then I'll take your daughter." The words fell like stones into still water. "See, I've done some research. Without your husband here to protest and with questions about your marriage's legitimacy, a judge might be persuaded that the child needs protection from an unfit mother. I have judges who owe me favors. Sarah felt the world tilt. You wouldn't dare. Wouldn't I sign the confession, leave Wyoming forever, and you can keep your child? Refuse, and I'll take her and raise her properly away from your influence. She'll never know your name. Hope began to cry, as if sensing her mother's distress. Sarah bounced her gently, her mind racing. Where was Daniel? He'd gone to check the far pastures, but that was hours ago. He should have been back by now. I need time to think, Sarah stalled. You have 5 minutes, Roy said, pulling out his pocket watch. Decide quickly, Mrs. Briggs. Your daughter's future depends on it. Sarah turned back to the schoolhouse, her students' frightened faces peering at her through the windows. These children depended on her. Hope depended on her. But signing that confession would destroy everything she and Daniel had built, would vindicate every lie ever told about her. Mrs. Briggs? It was Timothy Fletcher, the boy who'd warned her about Morrison before. Should I ring the bell? The school bell. Daniel had installed it so she could signal for help if needed. But Royce's men would hear it too, might react violently. 4 minutes, Royce called out. Sarah made a decision. Timothy, take the younger children out the back door. Run to the Fletcher farm and tell your father to ride for town. Get the sheriff. What about you, ma'am? I'll keep them talking. Go now. As Timothy quietly evacuated the younger students, Sarah walked back outside, Hope still crying in her arms. I won't sign anything without my husband present, she said firmly. Your husband's a bit tied up at the moment, Morrison said with a nasty grin. Found him checking his cattle. He's taking a little nap in his own barn. Terror shot through Sarah. If you've hurt him. He's alive, Royce said dismissively. Whether he stays that way depends on you. Sign the confession and we leave. Refuse and, well, Morrison here has some old scores to settle with Briggs. Sarah's hands shook as she tried to comfort Hope. She couldn't lose Daniel, couldn't let Hope grow up without her father. But signing that confession would destroy their life just as surely. 2 minutes. I'll sign, Sarah heard herself say. But only if you let me say goodbye to my students first. And I want your word that Daniel won't be harmed. You have it, Royce said, producing a prepared document from his coat. 1 minute to say goodbye. Sarah walked back into the schoolhouse where her remaining older students waited, their faces pale with fear. She handed Hope to Margaret Wilson, her oldest and most responsible student. Hold her for just a moment, Sarah said quietly. Then louder, children. I want you to know that no matter what you hear about me after today, I've been honored to be your teacher. She moved to her desk ostensibly to gather her things, but her hand found the derringer in the drawer. In one smooth motion, she palmed it, hiding it in the folds of her skirt. Time's up, Royce called. Sarah took Hope back from Margaret and walked outside. Royce had the confession laid out on a barrel, an inkwell and pen beside it. Read it aloud first, he commanded. I want witnesses to hear you admit your lies. Sarah looked at the paper, seeing the vicious words that would destroy her reputation forever. She thought of Daniel, possibly hurt, certainly in danger. She thought of Hope, innocent and vulnerable. She thought of the life they'd built, the happiness they'd found. She began, then stopped. In the distance, she heard something hoofbeats, many of them approaching fast. Royce heard it too. Sign it now, or Morrison goes to the barn and finishes your husband. No. The word came out stronger than Sarah expected. I won't sign lies to save myself. I won't teach my daughter that truth can be traded for safety. Then you've killed your husband and lost your child, Royce snarled, reaching for Hope. Sarah pulled out the derringer, pointing it at Royce's chest. Touch my daughter, and I'll kill you where you stand. Morrison and the other men went for their guns, but the approaching riders burst into view, Sheriff Watson, Doc Webb, and a dozen armed townsmen with Daniel riding at their head, blood on his face, but very much alive. Nobody move, Watson shouted, his rifle trained on Royce's men. Daniel! Sarah cried, relief nearly buckling her knees. I'm all right, he called, dismounting and moving toward her, his own gun drawn. Timothy Fletcher found me in the barn, cut me loose. We gathered everyone we could. Royce's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. This changes nothing. I've done nothing illegal. I simply asked Mrs. Briggs to sign a document. There's no law against that. There's a law against conspiracy to kidnap, Watson said grimly. We heard everything Blackwell. Threatening to take a child from her mother, that's a crime in any jurisdiction. You can't prove. Actually, we can. A new voice spoke from behind the schoolhouse, and Judge Harrison emerged with 3 other men, all federal marshals by their badges. We've been investigating you for months, Mr. Blackwell. Extortion, bribery, conspiracy. Your cousin's death was the final piece we needed. His death I had nothing to do with. The inmate who killed him was paid by someone using your bank accounts, the lead marshal said. We have the transfer records. You had your own cousin killed to use his death against Mrs. Briggs. The color drained completely from Royce's face. That's impossible. You can't prove. We can and we have. Royce Blackwell, you're under arrest for murder conspiracy and attempted kidnapping. As the marshals moved in, Morrison tried to run, but Daniel's shot took his hat off, stopping him cold. I wouldn't, Daniel said calmly. I missed on purpose that time. Within minutes, Royce Morrison and their hired men were in custody. The townspeople surrounded Sarah and Daniel, offering support and apologies for not arriving sooner. How did you know to come? Sarah asked Sheriff Watson. Young Timothy raised the alarm, but we were already on our way. Judge Harrison and the marshals arrived in town this morning looking for Blackwell. When we heard he'd ridden toward your school, Watson shrugged. We rode hard. Doc Webb was examining Daniel's head wound, tutting disapprovingly. You'll need stitches. Morrison really did a number on you. I've had worse, Daniel said, but his eyes never left Sarah and Hope. Are you both all right? We're fine, Sarah assured him, though she was trembling now that the danger had passed. I thought, when Morrison said they had you, Daniel pulled her and Hope into his arms, holding them like he'd never let go. It'll take more than Jake Morrison to keep me from my family. That evening, after the marshals had taken their prisoners away, and the excitement had died down, Sarah and Daniel sat on their porch with Hope sleeping peacefully between them. The stars were coming out brilliant in the clear Wyoming sky. You were going to sign it, Daniel said quietly. The confession. You were going to destroy yourself to save us. I would do anything to protect you and Hope, Sarah replied simply. But in the end, I couldn't. I couldn't teach our daughter that lies are acceptable when things get hard. You pulled a gun on Royce Blackwell, Daniel said with something like awe. A derringer against 8 armed men. A mother protects her child, Sarah said firmly. Besides, I learned from the best. You stood against 4 men for me once. That was different. No, it wasn't. It was exactly the same. Someone we loved was threatened, and we acted. She looked down at Hope sleeping peacefully despite the day's drama. She's going to grow up strong, isn't she? With parents who fight for what's right. She's going to grow up safe, Daniel corrected, with parents who love her and a community that protects its own. The next few weeks brought a parade of visitors to the ranch. The story of Sarah's stand against Blackwell had spread throughout the territory, and people came to express their admiration and support. Several newspapers wanted to interview her, but Sarah declined them all. I just want to teach and raise my family in peace, she told one persistent journalist from Cheyenne, but peace wasn't quite ready for them yet. On a cold November morning, Sarah received a letter that made her hands shake. It was from a law firm in Denver informing her that Charlotte Pemberton had left her a substantial inheritance in a will written just days before her death. She knew, Sarah said, showing the letter to Daniel. She knew Royce would come after us once she was gone, so she made sure we'd have resources to fight him. The inheritance was more than generous. It included several properties in Denver and enough money to ensure Hope would never want for anything. But more importantly, it included Charlotte's personal journals, which documented years of her family's crimes and corruptions. These need to go to the authorities, Daniel said, reading through one of the journals. There's enough here to put away half the corrupt officials in the territory. After we make copies, Sarah said firmly. Insurance, in case anyone else decides to come after us. Winter settled over Wyoming with its familiar, fierce beauty. The school was thriving, with 2 additional teachers hired to handle the growing number of students. Sarah had returned to teaching part-time, bringing Hope with her in a cradle Daniel had built that rocked gently while she taught. It was during one of these peaceful afternoons, Sarah teaching arithmetic while Hope napped, that she noticed a familiar figure standing at the back of the classroom. Mary Watson had brought her niece from back east, a young woman named Catherine, who'd recently been widowed and had come west to start over. After class, Mary introduced them properly. Catherine was educated, refined, but Sarah could see the shadows in her eyes, the look of someone who'd lost everything and was trying to rebuild. "Mrs. Watson tells me you might need another teacher," Catherine said hesitantly. "I have experience. I taught in Boston before my husband died." Sarah heard what Catherine wasn't saying, the desperation beneath the composed exterior, the need for not just work, but purpose. "Can you start Monday?" Sarah asked, and watched hope bloom in Catherine's eyes. "You didn't even ask for her credentials," Daniel said that evening as they prepared dinner together. "I didn't need to. She has the same look I had that night you found me. Lost, desperate, but still fighting." Sarah smiled. "Besides, Mary Watson wouldn't have brought her if she wasn't qualified." "You're building quite the institution," Daniel observed. 4 teachers now, almost 60 students. That's not just a school, it's an academy." "The Briggs Academy," Sarah said thoughtfully. "I like the sound of that." "The Whitfield Briggs Academy," Daniel corrected. "You started this. Your name should be on it." That night, as they lay in bed with Hope in her cradle beside them, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that desperate winter night when she'd thought her life was over. She'd been ready to trade her dignity for mere survival, but instead had found love, purpose, and a family. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" she asked Daniel. "If you hadn't been in town that night, if things had gone differently?" "I try not to," Daniel said honestly. "That way lies madness. But sometimes I think about how empty my life would have remained if I hadn't seen you that night. I'd still be going through the motions, existing but not living." "We saved each other," Sarah said softly. "We did." Daniel agreed, pulling her closer. "And we'll keep saving each other every day for the rest of our lives." Spring arrived with its usual mixture of mud and promise. Hope was crawling now, exploring every corner of the house with determined curiosity. The school had officially become the Whitfield Briggs Academy, with a proper sign that Daniel had carved himself. It was on a particularly beautiful April morning that Sarah realized she was pregnant again. Doc Webb confirmed it with his usual gruff kindness, warning her to take things easier this time. 2 babies in 2 years is hard on a body, Dan, he said. "You need to rest more, delegate more." "I have 3 other teachers now," Sarah pointed out. "I barely teach 2 days a week." "Good. Make it 1 day a week. That baby needs you healthy more than those students need you present." Daniel's reaction to the news was pure joy mixed with immediate concern. "We're hiring a housekeeper," he declared. "No arguments. You're not doing everything yourself with 2 babies to care for." Sarah started to protest, then stopped. He was right. She couldn't do everything herself, and trying to would only exhaust her. They hired Mrs. Chen, a widow from the Chinese community who'd been struggling to find work due to prejudice. She was efficient, kind, and wonderful with Hope, who took to her immediately. "People will talk," Mrs. Chen warned when Sarah offered her the position. "A Chinese housekeeper isn't common in these parts." "People always talk," Sarah replied. "I've learned to stop caring what they say." Summer brought news from the outside world. Royce Blackwell had been convicted of murder and conspiracy, sentenced to hang. Jake Morrison had gotten 20 years hard labor. The other men who'd threatened Sarah and Hope received various shorter sentences. "It's over," Daniel said when they received word. "Finally, truly over. That chapter is—" Sarah agreed, her hand on her growing belly. "But our story is just beginning." The new baby, a boy they named James Daniel Briggs, arrived in September just as the leaves were beginning to turn. Hope was fascinated by her little brother constantly wanting to pat his head and offer him her toys. Catherine, the young widow Sarah had hired, had blossomed into an excellent teacher and had started courting Timothy Fletcher's older brother, Robert. Sarah watched their tentative romance with a mixture of fondness and recognition, another broken soul finding healing in this harsh but beautiful land. "You're matchmaking," Daniel accused one evening, as Sarah not so subtly arranged for Catherine and Robert to chaperone a school dance together. "I'm facilitating," Sarah corrected primly. "There's a difference." "Is there now?"
Daniel pulled her into his arms, careful of baby James sleeping against her shoulder. And who facilitated us? Fate, Sarah said, then reconsidered. Or maybe desperation, or maybe God. Does it matter? Not at all, Daniel agreed, kissing her softly. However it happened, I'm grateful every day. As autumn progressed, the academy continued to grow. They added evening classes for adults who'd never learned to read, and Sarah watched with pride as rough cowboys and tired farmers' wives discovered the magic of words. One evening, as she was teaching a group of women basic arithmetic, one of them, a former saloon girl named Rose, asked her a question that stopped her cold. Mrs. Briggs, how did you keep going? When everyone turned against you, when you had nothing, how did you not just give up? Sarah looked at Rose, seeing her own past reflected in the woman's eyes. There was a moment when I almost did give up. I was standing in a doorway, freezing, starving, ready to trade anything for warmth. But then someone showed me kindness without asking for anything in return. That kindness gave me strength to keep fighting. Mr. Briggs, Rose said knowingly. Yes,
but also my own stubborn refusal to let the world break me. Sarah moved closer to Rose. You have that same stubbornness. I can see it. Whatever you've been through, whatever you've had to do to survive, it doesn't define your future. Only you can do that. Rose's eyes filled with tears. I want to be respectable again. I want to be someone my daughter can be proud of. Then be that person, Sarah said simply. It won't be easy. People will resist, will throw your past in your face. But if you keep pushing forward, eventually they'll see who you really are, not who you were. That conversation stayed with Sarah as she walked home through the cold night air. The ranch house glowed with warm light, and through the window she could see Daniel reading to Hope, while Mrs. Chen prepared dinner. This was what she'd traded herself for that night, not just shelter, but a home. Not just survival, but a life worth living. Not just safety, but love that transformed everything it touched. You're late, Daniel said as she entered, but his tone was fond rather than accusatory. Rose needed extra help with her numbers. Sarah explained, kissing Hope's head and checking on James in his cradle. You can't save everyone you know, Daniel said gently. No, Sarah agreed. But I can try to save the ones who cross my path, the way you saved me. You saved yourself, Daniel corrected. I just offered you a place to do it. After dinner, as they sat by the fire with their children playing at their feet, Sarah pulled out her journal and began to write. She'd been documenting their story, thinking perhaps one day Hope and James should know how their parents found each other. The day I met Daniel, she wrote, I thought I was trading myself for shelter. What I was given was a home, a purpose, and a man who believed in me enough to build a room just for my tomorrow. She paused, thinking about all the rooms Daniel had built for her, literal and metaphorical. The library where she could lose herself in books. The schoolhouse where she could teach. The nursery where their children could grow. Each room a promise, a future, a declaration of faith in what they were building together. What are you writing? Daniel asked, looking up from the piece of leather he was working into a new bridle. Our story, Sarah replied. So we never forget how far we've come. As if we could forget, Daniel said, but he was smiling. Hope toddled over, holding up a picture she'd drawn messy crayon strokes that might have been people or might have been potatoes. It was hard to tell. It's beautiful, sweetheart, Sarah said, pulling her daughter into her lap. What is it? Family. Hope said clearly, one of her new words. Mama, Papa, James, Hope. Family. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. From the ashes of her old life, she'd built this a family, a school, a place in the community. She'd gone from being whispered about as a fallen woman to being respected as an educator and mother. But more than that, she'd learned that sometimes what seems like an ending is really a beginning. That night in the doorway, she'd thought she was at the end of everything. But it had been the beginning of everything that mattered. Sarah, Daniel's voice pulled her from her thoughts. Yes, I love you. I don't say it enough, but I love you more than I have words for. Sarah smiled, reaching across to take his hand. You say it every day. In the rooms you build, the work you do, the way you look at our children. Words are nice, but actions speak louder. Still, Daniel said, squeezing her hand. You should hear the words too. You deserve to hear them. Then I love you too, Daniel Briggs, scars and all. Especially the scars, Hope piped up, having learned the phrase from hearing her parents say it. They laughed and James gurgled from his cradle as if he wanted to join in. Outside, snow began to fall again, the first of the season, covering the Wyoming landscape in pristine white. But inside the ranch house, all was warmth and light. Sarah looked around at her family, her home, her life, and marveled at how sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the best. She'd been prepared to trade her dignity for mere survival that night. Instead, she'd found love, purpose, and a future brighter than anything she could have imagined. The fire crackled in the hearth. Hope curled up against her side. Daniel's hand warm in hers, and James sleeping peacefully in his cradle. This was what she'd really traded for that night. Not just a room and a meal, but a life worth living, a love worth fighting for, and a future worth building. And as the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in quiet peace, Sarah knew that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the darkest moments. You just have to survive long enough to unwrap them.